Today we're talking to Roger Bootle for the Government and Public Sector Journal. Roger Bootle, it's fair to say, has been a leading economist for over 30 years. He has few peers in his field and he's served at top level in government, business and as a leading academic. He's recently published a book, The Trouble with Markets, which seeks to explain the current financial crisis. Roger, welcome to Manchester. A return to huge bonuses, banks not extending credit in line with business needs, non-disclosure of their exposure to toxic debt. Despite the bailout, banks and the banking system seem reluctant to comply with the prescription of central banks, politicians and public opinion. Would you agree?
I think there's some signs of movement on the part of the banks. A number of banks recently said they would comply with the G20 guidelines on bonuses et al. But in general, I think the banking system is still out of control. We haven't actually made, I think, a really serious attempt to make it act in line with the public interest.
What can be done to do that?
Oh, I think in the medium term we've got to restructure it, frankly. We can't have a system whereby we hope the likes of Peter Mandelson or some EU commissioner can tell them what they should lend or what they should pay themselves. I think we've got to have a system of more competition in banking. The banks have got to be broken up and there's got to be more pressure on them from shareholders.
And what about Mr. Brown's assertion of a banking tax to be brought in? Do you think that's a big disappointment for that to be rejected at St Andrews? Would you prefer a tax on banking transactions?
Well, I think somehow or other the banks have got to be made to pay for their bailouts. I don't mean in some sense of retribution. I mean going forward they have to pay for the fact that it seems as though society is not prepared to let them go bust. Now I think that view's right, because if they go bust, or at least big numbers of them, the big ones go bust, the consequences for the rest of us are just too awful to contemplate. Now given all that, it's quite frankly absurd that they should be allowed to gamble willy-nilly, pay themselves huge bonuses in the process, hoping everything goes right. If everything does go right, they pay themselves even bigger bonuses. If things go really badly wrong, they look to the taxpayer to bail them out. That's surely not on. So in some sense or other, we have to impose some sort of levy on them which compensates for the fact that there's, if you like, a public underwriting of what they do. That could be in a number of different forms. Now the idea of having a tax on transactions, a so-called Tobin tax, which was one of the ideas advanced by Gordon Brown, I don't think that's daft, I have to say. Now there are problems with it, problems of how you implement it and prevent banks getting around it and so on and so forth. But it seems to me that in the furore about Brown's suggestion, what's got lost is the idea that if it isn't that, it should be something else. And maybe the answer is instead to impose a sort of insurance levy on them. I don't think the detail, actually, in the end, it matters a great deal. As long as we do something, as long as we impose a tax on the banks, which makes them come face to face with the social costs.
Why do you think there was so much resistance to that at St Andrews, especially from the Americans?
Well, I suspect that particular proposal, for a variety of reasons, incenses them. Dare I say it, ideologically, yes. I've also got a ghastly feeling that maybe there's an issue here of special pleading, that of course so many of the banks who would be adversely affected by all this are American investment banks, and those American investment banks have got very strong links, by the way, with the American administration. So I'm not altogether surprised that they don't like that idea.
The crisis has leading on from that, the crisis has led to the ball being lanced. But has the wound been properly cleaned out? There's still a lot of toxic debt out there. It's not been accounted for. Surely there can be no meaningful recovery until this debt has been properly sorted out and apportioned.
Well, the IMF conducted a study recently trying to assess how much of the potential bad debt had actually been recognised, and it concluded, I think, something like about a half worldwide. Now, my own view, and I think this was the conclusion of the IMF as well, is that of that half that hasn't yet been recognised, probably most of it isn't the so-called toxic category. It's not these supposedly sophisticated instruments. It's more plain vanilla lending, mortgages, credit card debt, all that sort of stuff, lending to commercial property. I suspect that most of the toxic stuff probably is recognised. Indeed, some of it may actually even go up in value from the very low values or completely zero that have been effectively written down over the last couple of years. But overall, I think the picture is that the banks have got a lot of bad debts to recognise, and it's going to be one of the factors holding back their lending.
Quantitative easing. Is this not just printing money by another name?
Well, QE is effectively printing money. They don't actually print it because in the modern era, deposits at the central bank are exchangeable into notes. Most of it's just increasing deposits at the central bank. But if you like, it comes to the same thing as printing notes. What's different between that and Zimbabwe or Weimar Germany? Well, one of the differences is quite simply scale. We simply haven't done enough of it to remotely compare with what happened in Weimar Germany. But it's also the starting point. You've got an economy here that's mired in recession with an awful lot of excess capacity. If we are ultimately going to suffer from inflation as a result of all this, there's a stage before that we've got to go through. And that stage before is where people actually start spending all this money that's been pumped out by the central bank. Well, there isn't much sign of it, frankly. I mean, in some countries there's a pickup, but there isn't much of a pickup in Britain. You know, I think that the inflationary danger from all this has been very greatly exaggerated.
So you think that still the real threat is deflationary pressures rather than inflationary
I
pressures?
do.
Is China the next bubble to burst?
I don't think China's a bubble that needs to burst. I do think there's a significant problem, though, both for China and for the rest of the world, in these huge reserve holdings that the Chinese government has, which are mainly in dollars. The problem, well, one of the problems, is that you'd think that in the medium term, over a run of years, the Chinese currency's got to rise against the dollar, i.e. the dollar's got to fall. Of course, the Chinese government's trying to stop that in all sorts of ways. The problem is that, well, one of the problems is that if the Chinese currency were to rise and the dollar were to fall, with all these assets in dollars, the Chinese would lose actually quite a substantial amount of money. I think their whole approach to economic policy is profoundly wrong, not just in relation to the world, but in relation to China itself. And what we need to see, what they need to see, is a whole change of course towards more expansion of domestic demand, primarily consumption. Consumer spending in China needs to be growing a lot more strongly.
House prices. You predict a return to equilibrium, leading to an average decrease in real UK prices down to 35% from market highs. Now, given the return of house price inflation to 2008 levels in the current market, do you still think that this correction is on?
I think the next year is going to be a real test of opposing views on the housing market. There are people who think, indeed this seems to be reflected in market prices, that the housing market is now back, recovered from where it was before, and in fact it's all over. My view is that that's wrong. Not for the first time. The market could well have stabilised too early. On all the standard metrics that have served so well over the years as a guide to the housing market, this market here is amazingly overvalued still. So if it races up from here, then you can throw all those old metrics out the window, which I'm not prepared to do. In the US, for instance, it looks as though the market is now stabilising, but from a position very different from the UK. In the US, house prices are now actually cheap because they've fallen so far from a position that wasn't as overvalued as it was in the UK. Now, my view is that we'll see house prices fall again next year.